I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Sorry for my absence earlier this week. I had some issues to deal with family, some legal issues with family member that I had to deal with. But I have a big supersized edition of the program today for this 4th of July weekend. Before we get to that, I need to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener funded. So if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, check out my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson's Wall Street Window newsletter at wallstreetwindow.com, the best financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And now, what is this edition of the show going to be about? We're talking about the politics of MMA, and it's bigger than MMA. Nate Wilcox of the MMA Draw, a great publication covering combat sports, joins me to discuss the money behind MMA and its political connections to not just Trump, but Israel and Saudi Arabia. We'll be talking about the man behind TKO Group, the owners of UFC, namely Ari Emanuel. Most people focus on Dana White, but Ari Emanuel is the puppet master, says Nate Wilcox, and he has a lot of political interests. He's very deeply involved with the Republican establishment. His brother is Rahm Emanuel. We're going to be talking about all of this and much more in the conversation to follow. Even if you're not interested in MMA, I would highly recommend listening to this episode because this is about money and power that extends far beyond the world of combat sports. With that being said, let's get right to it with Nate Wilcox of the MMA Draw. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very happy to have on the show. Nate Wilcox of the MMA Draw. Welcome to Parallax Views, and I'm looking forward to this conversation we're going to be having about Freedom 250 and the UFC, what happened there, and also what is going on with the UFC's relationship with MAGA, and if this is coming back to bite UFC in the butt. We'll talk about all that and more. How are you doing, Nate Wilcox?
Very well, and thanks for having me on the show. Happy to be here.
I guess one of the places I wanted to start was, I think you take a very interesting angle on this recent Freedom 250 event. I see a lot of, how do I put this? I see a lot of folks that kind of get caught up in, I guess, culture war questions around MMA. You know, people will say, oh, Trump is having was having a gladiatorial battle on the White House lawn. And I get that, but I feel like the focus on, oh, I think MMA is kind of lowbrow, or this, sort of condescending attitude towards the sport itself doesn't necessarily get at the real problem, because to be honest, I like MMA. I like watching these fights. What bothers me isn't the fights and the sort of spectacle. It's the fact that you have a lot of different, very powerful interests involved in this. So I was wondering, do you ever think that people miss the forest for the trees when it comes to the commentary on MMA? I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I will give you a big on the nose, because falling for the culture war BS. Can I curse or not?
I'm trying to curse less because of the rules on YouTube and everywhere else now.
Yeah, I'll say grape and whatnot. Yeah, it's just fallen into the game that Trump and his people and Dana White and the people behind Dana White are playing. If you get all up, I mean, it was a gross thing what they did to the White House lawn, the dirt bikes, the whole thing. I mean, having a for-profit sporting exhibition with advertising on the White House lawn was gross. I totally understand that. The comments by Josh Hokett about Michelle Obama were definitely offensive, but they were designed to be offensive. It was rage bait. And if you're falling for a up and coming MMA fighter's shtick, it's pretty sad. I mean, this is a guy who's just trying to get ahead by marketing himself and also trying to please his corporate masters. And fundamentally, the thing I want to get at, and this is where I become a big conspiracy theorist and kind of outside the pale. I mean, there's a number of journalists that came out of MMA. Several of them used to work for me at Bloody Elbow, Luke Thomas and Kareem Zidane and others. And they mostly talk about Dana White and the culture war thing. And I totally understand that. But I'm one of these crazy people that believes that the owner of the company is actually the most important player in the game. And Ari Emanuel and TKO and the WME group and Silver Lake, which is the financial power behind all that, they're the real players. And they took over the UFC in 2016 when they bought most of it for $4 billion from the previous owners. And that's when there was suddenly a turn and Dana White suddenly became politically outspoken. Remember, before 2016, Dana White celebrated Pride Week. Dana White, they still sell Pride t-shirts and stuff, but they made a big deal about it from 2010 to 2015. And they sanctioned fighters for making rape jokes, for making homophobic jokes. They definitely cracked down hard on domestic violence, which of course Dana White has had his own issues with since, publicly video came out in 2023 of him and his wife engaged in an altercation. And admittedly, she struck first, but I'd have to give it a 10-8, maybe a 10-6 round to Dana in that one. I mean, he stomped her down pretty quick and thoroughly and might have followed the slaps up with kicks. It's hard to tell from the video. But anyway, my point is that Dana White had been a donor to Harry Reid, the Democratic Senate, leader who came from Nevada. I mean, he's
I want you to
was
real quick, not to interrupt you. I want you to delve into that a little bit deeper for my audience because I think there's this mentality that I've heard that UFC has always been, or just MMA in general, has always been associated with like super right wing. But at times the UFC has tried to court Democrats like Harry Reid. Can you talk about that history a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, MMA was a new sport. I mean, it's an ancient sport. It goes back to the, Greek and Roman Olympics, the pancration event, which wasn't when they revived the Olympics in the 19th century, was left off the table when boxing and wrestling were included. Pancration was just seen as too brutal and barbaric. And that just meant anything goes fighting, where they allowed you to, wrestle and hit. And the UFC sort of accidentally created this new thing in 1993 when they held a pay-per-view event that was basically designed to promote Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and to be a pay-per-view spectacle. John Milius, the director of Conan the Barbarian and scriptwriter of Apocalypse Now, was heavily involved in it. And the whole cage fighting, I think that was Milius' idea. And it was a collision of basically two variants of pro wrestling culture. And I'm getting way too deep in the weeds. You'll have to keep me on
No,
point.
no,
But
no. I want you to get in the weeds with this.
okay, because essentially, Hoist Gracie was coming out of this Brazilian tradition they called Vale Tudo, which comes straight out of carnival wrestling. Uh, uh, Maeda, the judoka who came to Brazil and taught the Gracie brothers judo, which they rebranded as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and in a way did make a new sport because they emphasized submissions rather than throws, which the judo rules have relentlessly, and judo was a distillation of the samurai art of jiu-jitsu, which, was meant to finish off your opponent after you knocked him off his horse or the swords had been dropped or whatever. And Maeda was a disciple of the founders of jiu-jitsu, and forgive Kano, I'm blanking on his name. And I might have that wrong, but this dude toured the Carney wrestling circuit in North America, started in Seattle, went all the way down to Cuba and down into South America, and basically challenging wrestlers who and wrestling at this time was professional, but it was largely real. Occasionally, frequently two wrestlers would probably fix a match. Like if you're out in the gold mines in the Yukon and you and some other guy are both pro wrestlers that are on the circuit, you're not going to really cripple yourselves in front of these yokel miners in the middle of nowhere. But if some really rough and tough miner comes up and wants to to wrestle you, you'll break his ankle so you don't have to wrestle him again, you know. And Maeda took his techniques of judo distilled from jiu-jitsu and did quite well against these mainly English trained, what they called catch wrestlers. Catch
Right. The
wrestling is
catch
a
as
style
catch
of
can.
wrestling.
Billy
Yeah.
Robinson, yeah.
Yeah.
Snake
And these
pit.
guys predated that, but these were guys who
Right.
knew bone-breaking holds, basically, and incorporated them with freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling techniques. And Maeda fought his way all the way down to South America, where the Gracie brothers, hired him. They were a wealthy Scots family that had made it down to Brazil. Extremely right-wing throughout their whole history, by the way, slave owners and backers of the Brazilian fascist government
Yeah,
in the
wasn't
1960s.
Helio Gracie involved with the Brazilian integralists or something? Or
Yeah, and I'm not prepared to discuss all that in detail. Don't want to
yeah,
get the
no problem,
details
no
wrong, but
problem.
but
Yeah.
they were definitely aligned with the U.S. backed fascist dictatorship that ran Brazil in the 1960s. If you love Brazilian psychedelic music of the 1960s, these are the people who destroyed all those creative musicians. Um, anyway, my point is that there was this Vale Tudo tradition that basically consists of the Gracies occasionally challenging catch wrestlers. And Brazilian pro wrestling never got completely fake the way it did in the US. And they never made Vale Tudo into a commercial sport because they couldn't stop fighting each other. They had a popular TV show in the 50s, there was another one in the 70s, and they would always inevitably end up with two different training camps would erupt into brawls, and people just were like, I can't do business with this. And even in the 1990s, Brazilian MMA imploded because of a riot at an event in which Renzo Gracie was fighting Eugenio Taddeo, a representative of Luta Livre, aka freestyle wrestling, anything goes wrestling. And although by that time Luta Livre had been learning from judo and jiu-jitsu the whole time, and it was mostly a class difference where the Gracies were definitely representing the upper class. And you still see this today with Brazilian fighters, many of whom back Bolsonaro and the right wing. Anyway, meanwhile, the Japanese, all throughout the 70s and 80s, had been fascinated with all forms of combat sports, but especially pro wrestling. And again, I'm blanking on the name of the key innovator, so apologies. But this guy actually fought Muhammad Ali in a no rules match in 1976, and it's appalling that I can't remember his name. But they did a number of worked matches featuring judo Olympians, or the Ali match, which was not worked and did permanent
Were
damage
you
to
thinking of
Ali.
Antonio Inoki?
Yes, Antonio Inoki, exactly. And Inoki fought Ali, but he crawled on his back most of the time and leg kicked Ali throughout the match. It was terrible entertainment, but it was a pioneering experiment. And by the 1980s, they had a number of the last holdouts of the old catch wrestling schools who'd basically been driven out of American pro wrestling because it was all worked, came to Japan, and people respected him. And all these catch wrestling holds were then taught to Japanese fighters. So ironically, the Japanese fighters were preserving the English tradition of catch as can wrestling, and the Brazilians were preserving the Japanese tradition of full-on jiu-jitsu with submission holds. And they collided when Ken Shamrock, who had trained in Pancrase, fought in Pancrase, and learned catch as catch can via, they called it shoot wrestling because it meant shoot as in not a work. And he fights Royce Gracie and loses, but then beats him, or they didn't have decisions then, but dominated him for 30 minutes at UFC 5 in 1995. Anyway, my point is that it was this crazy thing that was world historic in terms of athletics, and it revived pancration, which had been dead for 2,000 years as a sport. And ever since that first UFC in 1993, the sport has been a successful commercial activity. Even though SEG, the original promoters of the UFC, got into trouble with John McCain and got driven off pay-per-view, they helped trigger a massive explosion in Japan where things like the Pride organization, various things like Shudo and Pancrase and Rings, uh, uh, did commercially successful events. They had multiple Vale Tudo Japan events in the 90s, but it culminated in Pride, which was the dominant MMA organization from 2000 to 2007. Anyway, my point is that and when the UFC was taken off the air in the United States, there was a grassroots movement that was a very Gen X libertarian style movement, but a lot of the people that were involved in it or fans of it, like me, were more left coded, a lot of anarchist types rather than, later on there were different political splits. But at that time, in the 90s, we thought we had it all worked out and racism was in the past and yada yada yada, and people can be edgy and make racist jokes because it's all been solved. And people like Joe Rogan saw themselves as progressives. I mean, he endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016, and a lot of MMA fans were like that. Luke Thomas and myself, for sure. The Bloody Elbow was a website I founded in 2007. That was one of the biggest websites in the 2010s. It was a very leftish community that
Well, yeah,
ultimately
and
kind of,
and the biggest, not to interrupt you, but like one of the biggest opponents back in the day of MMA was, like you said, John McCain, a Republican. So I mean, there's
yeah,
always
and a
been that
boxing
right
fan.
element, but it's also complicated.
Yeah, it's all everything's complicated. This is, real life, but politically, and the Zuffa who bought the Fertitta brothers, who are of Las Vegas gambling dynasty that bought the UFC in 2001, 2002 for a few $1 million. Can't remember if it was 2 or 4 million. Um, they were very focused, and they brought in Dana White, or Dana White put them onto it, whatever. They had the money. Dana White was the MMA fan. Their original vision was, this thing's going to be the biggest sport in the world. This is going to be bigger than soccer. And to do that, we don't want to offend people. We want to be good corporate citizens. We want to float with the tide. And, in the Bush era, weren't, they were busy just trying to get noticed. They weren't even big enough to be political. And in the Obama era, they were down with whatever woke was happening. I mean, Pride Week, et cetera, et cetera. They've always been kind of racist. I think Dana White is personally racist. He's always shown a marked preference for white fighters. And, if you want to go back to 2007 and watch his heartbreak, when Rampage Jackson, a black fighter, knocked out Chuck Liddell in Atlanta, Dana White, it's pretty clear he wasn't happy about that. I mean, Chuck Liddell was a guy he had personally managed, was a close personal friend, et cetera, et cetera. But he's always leaned towards guys like Matt Hughes, the All-American corn-fed wrestler, et cetera, et cetera. And he had problems with fighters like George St. Pierre, who was Quebecois, French Canadian, and one of the biggest and greatest stars, they ever had. But he worked with all kinds of fighters. Anderson Silva, an African, a Brazilian of Afro descent, became one of their biggest stars, and probably the biggest events in MMA history came in the 2010s when Anderson Silva was headlining UFCs that were on Globo, the biggest Brazilian TV network. And their goal at the time was just to be a sport, to be regular, to be accepted, to be corporate, to be normal, to do what the other corporations did. But then when this liberal Democrat, Ari Emanuel, whose brother is Rahm Emanuel, the former Obama White House chief of staff, former mayor of Chicago, Biden ambassador to Japan, current 2028 Democratic nomination presidential hopeful, which God save us. And Ari Emanuel's younger brother was a very successful Hollywood agent who founded his own agency called Endeavor in the 1990s with a guy named Patrick Whitesell. They became immortalized on the show Entourage, where this character Ari Gold was based on Ari Emanuel. And he's just your classic hard-charging Hollywood Jewish guy from Chicago who cuts deals and looks out for his clients. He's an incredible negotiator. He's become a billionaire off the back of the UFC and the WWE. His Hollywood agent, I mean, but
Yeah,
Will
he also runs what, WME Group, right?
yeah, well, William Morris, I was about to get that. William Morris bought Endeavor in 2009, and it was a partnership, and there was a corporate dust up and a vote. And at the end of that vote, the existing partners of William Morris voted to make the kid they had just bought, his small firm, the chairman of William Morris Endeavor, which shows you Ari Emanuel is a dangerous corporate boardroom knife fighter. I mean, they bought him, and he walks out the boss like he bought them. And then they buy IMG, which is another massive agency and basically Hollywood based. And then they buy Zuffa for $4 billion in 2016, or a big part of it. And they finished, I think, in 2018 or 2019 buying all of it. Meanwhile, he had Endeavor, which was he had hoped to make a publicly traded company that would include his talent agencies and On Location, which does the VIP packages at NFL events, et cetera, and all kinds of other weird stuff he's into, like professional bull riding. And he has another company now that's just buying a big Broadway and London West End theatrical group. And anyway, his aspirations to make that a publicly traded company failed repeatedly. Like they tried to make it they tried to have public offerings and so on and so forth. And COVID really killed them. The whole thing nearly went tits up and went bankrupt, except Dana White pushed. And because of their connections, which Zuffa had with the UAE and Saudi Arabia long before Ari Emanuel came on, but they were able to host fights in the UAE on quote unquote Fight Island during COVID, and that saved the empire. And then Silver Lake, which is a private equity fund headed up by this guy named Egan Durbin, who took Dell private and then took it back public. This guy Egan Durbin is a massive financial powerhouse, and his biggest clients are Michael Dell and Ari Emanuel. So that'll tell you who he's aligned with sort of politically in our current era. And they saved the empire, but they had to ultimately in 2024 take Endeavor private. In 2023, when they bought WWE, they split it off UFC and WWE and bull riding into TKO, which has been very successful as a publicly traded stock. It's like 2.5x. I haven't checked the value today, but it's done very well. Whereas Endeavor flopped on the stock market and had to be taken private. And Silver Lake owns even more of it. And Silver Lake and Endeavor own most of TKO, like over 60% or over 50% for sure. And so that's how stocks work these days, where the public investors don't necessarily have control of the company in any way, shape, or form and can't get it. The companies like Meta and SpaceX, et cetera, the bosses have it all fixed so that there can't be shareholder revolts or takeovers or that kind of thing. But anyway, in 2016, Ari Emanuel takes over the company, and suddenly Dana White and Donald Trump are best friends, which they were not before. That is indisputable fact.
Real quick, not to interrupt. I want to go back to this real quick. So when was the collaboration with Harry Reid?
There was no necessary collaboration,
Or
but
not collaboration, but
the Fertittas and Dana White were donors to Harry Reid.
Right.
That was their biggest donations, was the most powerful politician in Nevada, because they essentially cared mostly about Nevada politics, because their big goal was to get sanctioned by the athletic commissions in all 50 states. And it took them almost a full decade. I can't remember when they finally, New York was the last domino to fall. And I think that was in 2018 or 2019. AOC actually is the reason that or started the dominoes falling that allowed them to get sanctioned in New York, because there was a corrupt Democratic senator who voted with the Republicans all the time, and Cuomo secretly had this group of 8 Democrats who had enough votes when they aligned with the Republicans, which they coincidentally always did, so that Cuomo and the Republicans could dominate the Democratic legislature and keep New York on a right-wing corporate path. And AOC set off by knocking off Joe Crowley, who is the number 3 Democratic congressman. Then she backed challenges against all 8 of those turncoat Democrats that won once. And that guy also, the main guy whose name I'm forgetting, also had some criminal problems. And so once that guy was gone, then New York could finally sanction it. MMA was sanctioned in all 50 states. One of the UFC's strategies was run to regulation. Let's get regulated. Let's have only one rule set that's sanctioned, that athletic commissions approve of. Anyway, so my point is that the Fertittas and Dana White, up to 2016, their political interest was limited to athletic commissions and the states that had powerful athletic commissions: Nevada, California.
That sometimes meant like lobbying or fundraising for Democrats. Okay.
Yeah, because Nevada was their home base and Harry Reid was this huge powerhouse. Of course, they're going to give to Harry Reid. And they had hosted some events early in their tenure at Donald Trump properties, but Donald Trump wasn't a big presence at any of those events. He certainly wasn't a personal friend of Dana White, and the SEG that owned the UFC before Zuffa took it over had already had events in New Jersey at Donald Trump properties. And then Donald Trump becomes the front man for Affliction MMA, which was a t-shirt company that had gotten rich as part of the MMA grassroots explosion that the UFC capitalized on. And then when the UFC squeezed out sponsors, Affliction was like, F you, we're going to start our own promotion and put on 2 and almost 3 pay-per-views that didn't do well, they spent a lot of money, and for fight fans, there were great matchups, but they just didn't know how to market the pay-per-views. They didn't have a cable partner, etc. But they did have Donald Trump as their front man and brand ambassador. And so Dana and Trump actually did some back and forth trash talking in that period. And then, but you never there's multiple veteran MMA journalists that will tell you, and people like Ant Evans, who was the PR guy for the UFC at the time, will tell you you cannot find a press release or an article or anything from the time the UFC takes the Zuffa takes over the UFC until 2016 that talks about Donald Trump and Dana White having any kind of relationship whatsoever.
So this wasn't, it sounds like the UFC before a certain point tried to sort of come off as apolitical in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
They
Yeah.
just want to be like the NFL or soccer or Major League Baseball or whatever.
Right. And if you do it that way, you don't alienate an audience, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Ari Emanuel at one point was Donald Trump's agent. Okay. Long before he had any positive relationship with the UFC, he worked with Ari Emanuel. Ari Emanuel helped The Apprentice happen and helped Donald Trump be the guy that was on The Apprentice. Like, remember, Donald Trump, the Donald Trump persona that got elected was essentially created by Zucker and the producers of The Apprentice. He was a disastrously bad businessman who had a high profile because he talked a lot of trash, but he went bankrupt 6 times, and his businesses were casinos and shoddy real estate developments. It was only The Apprentice that created this persona of the tough talking, you're fired, art of the deal, blah, 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 Donald Trump, that created his presidential campaign. And also, it's documented that Trump only announced he was going to run for president as a negotiating ploy with whatever network, I think it was NBC, had The Apprentice. Because he thought, I'll announce for president, I'll be in the top 5 polling, and then I'll go back to him and say, hey guys, I could run for president or you could pay me more. But Zucker, who had been his showrunner and guru at The Apprentice, had become the executive director of CNN at the time. And so Trump was worth a lot more to Zucker and CNN as a presidential candidate. CNN runs 26 Trump rallies in full. It might have been 36, whatever the number is, but multiple, over a dozen Trump rallies in full. Did they ever air a Bernie Sanders rally in full? No, not once, not ever, even though Bernie was drawing much bigger crowds than Trump ever did. And so there's this whole business, corporate incentive, Hollywood incentive behind Trump that always kept him at arm's length. Like CNN is quote unquote the liberal network, right? And
Well, it's
the
even true with
network.
Ari, right? It's true with Ari
Yeah.
Emanuel. I mean, he's a huge backer of the Democratic Party, but he's also cavorting with Trump constantly.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, Ari Emanuel is a Democratic insider. And in fact, he's a key Democratic power broker who was the first major Democratic donor to call for Joe Biden not to be the nominee in 2024 after the debate, right? So simultaneously, his employee, Dana White, is introducing Trump at the 2016, 2020, and 2024 Republican National conventions, while Ari Emanuel is insulated enough for this from the UFC and its right-wing leanings to be publicly a massive kingmaker in Jewish Democratic Hollywood circles. And at the meeting, or it was at the Simon Wiesenthal Memorial Luncheon, where he called for Biden to step down as the nominee, right in front of Jeffrey Katzenberg of DreamWorks, who was the Biden co-chair of the Biden campaign and had bundled George Clooney and all these other Democratic donors in Hollywood, bundled all that money and got everybody to back Biden. And then people like Clooney bitched later, like, I said, I went to some of these events for these, Golden Plate Club members or whatever. You pay $100,000, you expect some candidate time. And Biden was in such a zombie state, you couldn't even talk to him. You weren't even allowed to talk to him. And I'm pissed at Katzenberg. And so Ari Emanuel has, from what I've heard, supplanted Katzenberg as the top Jewish Democrat in Hollywood, which is one of the top Democrats and donors in the country. And even after the White House event, the New York Post had an article on page 6 there, before TMZ, page 6 was like the gossip column of record. And they were like, Ari Emanuel was seen at the White House event. He probably doesn't like that we're mentioning it. Right. And if you watch the event, Dana White and Trump do the big walk from the White House to the Octagon. And the only person whose hand Donald Trump shakes is Ari Emanuel, who's sitting cage side. But they don't mention him on the broadcast. None of the fighters called him out. They called out Mark Shapiro, shook hands with Mark Shapiro, et cetera, who's his right-hand man and the COO of the TKO WME empire. But they kept Ari kind of on the down low. But Ari was there, and it got called out, by the New York Post and others. And that to me reveals sort of this hustle behind the whole thing. And your question is like, is the UFC damaging itself by getting too close to Trump? Yes, absolutely. But does Ari Emanuel care? No, because I think he's always viewed the UFC as a disposable property that he's brilliantly used to capitalize on the Trump era. He has had and exploited political access to Donald Trump at least multiple times in this second tenure. I'm not as clear on, I don't know of any specific instances in Trump's first term where Ari Emanuel called on him for favors, but I'm sure there were some. But we know that he's called Donald Trump on behalf of Live Nation and Ticketmaster, which
Hasn't he
Ari,
also helped out Ellison, Dave Ellison,
yes, and we'll
Mr.
get to that
Paramount?
because it's
Okay,
a
okay.
much bigger thing. But Ari used to be on the board of Live Nation and Ticketmaster and was forced off because of antitrust concerns because he was such a big talent manager. And in fact, one of the reasons for the strikes that Hollywood had in the early 2020s was because WME was moving to not only be a talent representative, but be a content producer and maybe even own a studio. So they were looking to have a full 360-degree monopoly like the one they have over the UFC. If you look at the UFC, the fighters get only 15% of the revenue share, which compared to NFL or NBA or MLB, they get like 48, 49%. And boxers like Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao, they might get 78, 90%, 70 to 90% of the revenue. But the UFC fighters are crushed because they don't have, they're only getting 15% of the revenue. They don't have financial resources to hire big lawyers and big time managers. And in fact, the big four managers who represent most of the UFC fighters pretty much work for the UFC rather than the fighters. In fact, one of them, Ali Abdelaziz, is frequently seen at UFC headquarters, like in videos they put out of Hunter Campbell, who's the guy who actually runs the UFC for Dana White on the day-to-day. You'll see Dana and Hunter and Ali in the cafeteria just shooting the shit, just a regular day. Of course, Ali's hanging out at the office, right? And he went to Uzbekistan with them just a couple weeks ago because they're playing an event in Uzbekistan. He was a key part of them getting an event in Azerbaijan, in Baku recently, that they had their first event there. And of course, is all plugged in with the Saudis. And now Ali Abdelaziz is a guy who really bears further inquiry. There was an MMA writer named Mike Russell who documented and exposed a lot of facts that only came out really when Conor McGregor repeated the stuff. And since Ali didn't sue him, we're pretty comfortable that these things were true. Ali has been accused of having been arrested on 9/11 with multiple passports, having been questioned by the FBI because of potential involvement with 9/11. He's a Saudi, remember, and allegedly became a snitch for the FBI in all this. So this guy is plugged in and shady, 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 shady. And then back to the whole global Zionist thing. Ari Emanuel, it's well documented on at least two instances, helped David Ellison, who's the son of Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, take over first Paramount and now WBD, formerly Warner Brothers Discovery. Shari Redstone, who finally inherited her father Sumner Redstone's Viacom empire, and if you've ever seen Succession, it's not only about the Fox Murdoch family, it's also about the Redstone family, because the main young male character in Succession, who has the rug pulled on him several times, like, you're going to be the new boss, dad's going to retire. That was Shari Redstone that stuff happened to, not any of the Murdochs. The Murdoch children have had the vicious rivalries between themselves and currying their father's favor. But it was Shari Redstone who got rug pulled multiple times with, you're going to be in charge. No, you're not. Or now you're in charge. Oh, change my mind. And Sumner Redstone finally died at, a million years old. Shari then runs headlong into the death of there was a streaming bubble in Hollywood up until 2022. Everybody thought, oh my God, the studios are going to go in there and they're going to mop the floor with Netflix and show them how it's done and get these internet punks out of there. And they're going to stream and they're going to make all this money and they're going to run shit like they always have. And in 2022, it became clear they weren't going to, and investors pulled their money out. And so Viacom, along with the death of cable and the collapse of their stock price, Viacom became this bleeding ulcer. It had been, this profitable, massively profitable, growing machine throughout the cable TV era. But once that was over, she was a dead woman walking, and was never that talented as an executive anyway. And it's documented that Ari Emanuel was one of two people. I can't remember who the other one was. It was an actor who reassured Shari Redstone that David Ellison was good Hollywood people, that he'd made his bones in Hollywood. He'd been in town for 10 years. He had co-produced all these Top Gun sequels, and his sister had been making these art movies that were much more successful. But David had been commercially or much more respected. David was more successful because Top Gun, how can you go wrong, right? In the franchise era. But he's a thickie and a Nepo baby fail son. So,
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he dropped out of film school.
Yeah, he's not a genius. And if it wasn't for daddy's money, he wouldn't be anything. But Ari helped him clear that hurdle with Shari, who did not want to pass on, the Paramount legacy to somebody who wasn't good Hollywood people. She didn't want Silicon Valley barbarians and Philistines coming in and taking over this storied, legendary American Hollywood studio. And then he helped the Ellisons clear the hurdles with Trump. Now, a lot of articles about Larry Ellison and David Ellison and Trump will tell you Larry Ellison was MAGA from the beginning. He backed Trump in 2016. All of that's true, but Larry Ellison and Trump parted ways after January 6th, and Ellison backed Democrats in 2020, and he backed
Rick Scott in the presidential campaign in 2024? Yeah.
Yeah. And is it Rick or Tim? I thought it was the anyway, but it was somebody named Scott.
I may be getting it wrong. Scott. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it was Tim Scott, the Black North Carolina Congress senator, not Rick Scott, the Florida senator, who I don't believe ever ran for president, because the guy
I mixed up the names. I apologize.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's fine.
Apologies to my listeners. Go on.
but so that's the kind of thing Donald Trump remembers and never forgets. And watch how he's treated Bezos and Zuckerberg and these other billionaires who resisted him in his first term, really screwed him. I mean, Zuckerberg and his relationship is complicated because Facebook really helped Trump get elected in 2016. Forget about Russia and even forget Cambridge Analytica. They posted up key Facebook staffers in the San Antonio office of Trump's campaign manager in 2016 to help him run Facebook. Meanwhile, CNN is airing all his debates all through it. So those are the two most responsible entities, corporate entities. But then Zuckerberg joined in on the whole social media censorship stuff and like the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which was absolutely censorship and suppression and alignment with the Democratic Party, and the whole Jeff Bezos Washington Post democracy dies in darkness BS and all that crap. Trump didn't forget any of that. And it doesn't matter how much money these guys give him or Zuckerberg putting Dana White on the board. He doesn't care about any of that. He remembers that and he's punishing them for it. And he's said multiple times things about the Ellisons that were, even after they were in process of buying Paramount, he still was threatening to them and not friendly with them. And David Ellison attended 2 UFCs, one right after Trump was elected in 2024 and one right after he was inaugurated. And Ari Emanuel personally introduces Ellison to Trump at both of those events. And at one of those events, Ellison and Trump were seen arguing or raising voices, and Ari Emanuel comes over and smooths the waters. And so Ari Emanuel is known to have played a massive role in Skydance, which was David Ellison's small-time Hollywood production company, made that acquisition of Paramount possible. And then has been linked to reports that he and Jared Kushner assisted with getting sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East to back Larry Ellison's financing of the WBD acquisition. And this one is a real shady one because Variety reported on like a Friday that there was all this sovereign wealth money from the Middle East, from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which if you can get all three of those countries to agree on anything, you're either lobbing missiles at them from Iran or you're Ari Emanuel. Because they've had all kinds of conflicts. I mean, they're close to each other, but they also are constantly fighting. And he got all through. Anyway, Variety publishes this report, which is immediately pulled down, although it's later confirmed that those sovereign wealth funds did own will own 25% of the new Paramount Sky, WBD, or whatever they call this Leviathan. But the bit about Jared Kushner and Ari Emanuel being the ones who put the financing together, I could swear I read that the day it came out. And even on the Internet Archive, that part's not in the Variety story that was pulled down. So I could be wrong about that. Maybe I just imagined that. But it does, to me, it's like that's got that Ari's fingerprints on it, that thing. Because, Ari Emanuel has Mubadala, which is a sovereign wealth fund owned by the UAE, is a big investor in Silver Lake, which owns WME, which owns TKO. Big cash investor in this play, the money behind the money. And Ari Emanuel and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and dictator of Saudi Arabia, have a relationship such that after Khashoggi was killed, Adnan Khashoggi, the Washington Post reporter, was murdered in the Turkish consulate, allegedly by Saudis. I mean, it was in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. So, yeah, I mean, nobody's really ever denied that they murdered this
We
guy.
say allegedly for
Yeah, because they've got a lot of money and they can crush us like bugs anytime they choose to. But Ari made a big show of canceling a deal or maybe even returning $400 million to MBS and bragging in the press about how he had to quintuple his bodyguards because he was so scared of the Saudis, which is a reasonable thing to do. But since Trump's reelection, they've been just as cozy as clams. They've held events in Saudi Arabia. A Saudi wealth fund, Sela, owns 60% of Zuffa Boxing, which is their attempt to monopolize boxing like they've monopolized pro wrestling and mixed
golf.
martial arts.
Aren't they trying to do that with golf too?
The Saudis were doing that, but that was a different shake. The Saudi that's the Saudis that are involved with TKO are different than the guy who was behind Live Golf, who seems to be out of favor. Remember, the Saudis had this whole plan to diversify their economy because they're not making enough on oil to run the massive welfare state that keeps them from, suffering a rebellion and getting overthrown, like people have been predicting for the last 80 years. Anyway, the Saudis invested in all this ridiculous nonsense, like Noem, the linear city, which some American consulting groups sold them on this harebrained scheme, which they literally wasted billions of dollars on, and were planning to squander trillions of dollars, making a city that was literally a straight line connected by a bullet train, like 2 miles wide and 5 stories high or 17 stories high. And they didn't put the math together that if you're going to, their thing was, well, you can connect people 150 kilometers apart with this bullet train because it goes X kilometers an hour. But yeah, dude, you're supposed to be stopping at blocks all along the way. You're never going to get up to bullet train speed. You're running a tram, not a bullet train. And so it's just this completely nonsensical scheme. And, we've got Turki Al-Sheikh, who's been in his Riyadh season, who's one of MBS's boys, who The Guardian reported in 2022 was literally the muscle, the goon that threatened the then crown prince of Saudi Arabia with horrible things if he didn't sign over his title to MBS. And Turki Al-Sheikh, who's not a sheikh, who's not royalty, although his grandfather was the founder of Wahhabism, the crazy fundamentalist religious sect the Saudis have promulgated all through the Middle East and Central Asia, and is officially blamed for 9/11. But Turki Al-Sheikh was just a guy who was connected but not of the Saud family, and he grew up with MBS. He was kind of an older brother to MBS. They would watch WWE and play video games together when MBS was a young kid. And that's where this whole fascination with combat sports comes from. And Turki Al-Sheikh is one of MBS's, guys, like the guy who ran Noem, the linear city, who has since been fired, and God help him, I don't know what they've done to him since, and the guy who ran LIV Golf, who's also been demoted. So far, Turki hasn't been demoted, but he's not directly involved with Zuffa Boxing. That's a different company named Sela, which seems to be run by Saudi financial guys in England, more so. It's Saudi money, but the people behind it are very quiet, whereas Turki Al-Sheikh is very loud, and he's, backed all these Usyk and Fury and Wilder and Anthony Joshua fights, and he got Francis Ngannou, the UFC champ, in a boxing ring with Fury and Wilder or Joshua, sorry. And has squandered all this money on these fantasy boxing matches. Like they held an event in Times Square that was so poorly organized, they didn't clear it with the city. It happened, and it happened in Times Square, but they had to build a big temporary fence around it so nobody could see it was happening from Times Square. So the whole vision was we're going to have a boxing event right on Times Square as people are walking, and that's just not possible. And I think that whoever was the genius behind that was also the genius behind the UFC White House event, because it's the same kind of thinking. Like they were talking about how they're going to have a massive boxing event in Alcatraz and that kind of stuff. And so allegedly, the official story is it was Donald Trump's idea and he whispered it to Dana White. My money is on Turkey Al-Sheikh or the people around him, because they were the ones who've been going around putting on these, or attempting to put on these ridiculous spectacles in these marquee locations around the world.
Do you think there was a lot of the Saudi fingers were in the pie, so to speak?
Yes, I mean they're intimately connected with TKO. We know for a fact that Sella, which is a Saudi sovereign wealth fund company, owns 60% of Zuffa Boxing, which is aspiring to be like a third of TKO. TKO has other businesses like IMG and On Location and professional bull riding, but most of its revenue comes from or most of its profits come from the UFC and the WWE. And
Uh,
and go ahead.
well, I wanted to get into the Zionist element, but maybe you can finish your thought.
Well, the Zionist element, Paramount, the Ellison's whole thing is it's not a business play. It's a Zionist play.
Right.
Like
And
you don't
I want to note here real quick, we're not on like the wavelength of like people like Nick Fuentes or
no, definitely
like
not.
Bryce Mitchell. We're not like far right wingers saying this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm ashamed to say I was a Zionist for most of my life. And the scales fell from my eyes through the 2000s, the different intifadas and the invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And so by the time October 7th happened, and then I knew what was going to happen afterwards. And since then, it's just been so disgusting and revolting to watch this genocide that American taxpayers are funding and we're arming, and Joe Biden greenlighted. I don't even think Trump would have let that happen. I mean, Biden just completely signed, and it wasn't even Biden. I mean, Biden was senile the whole time. From what we can tell, it was Anthony Blinken, Sullivan, and a couple of the super Zionist fake ambassador they had to Lebanon at the time.
Brett
Those were the
McGirt,
people.
people like that. Yeah.
Yeah, Brett McGirt. These were guys who were really running the Biden foreign policy. Meanwhile, Jill and a coterie of people around her were running everything else in the White House. And so, like when Biden was abandoned after that debate performance, and even most of his staff had quit, and even his old Delaware consultants had quit, there were like the only people standing by Biden were Hunter, Jill, her two spokespeople, which are absolutely the most powerful first lady staffers in American history. And one old Delaware consultant who came out of retirement to circle around him in the bunker time, right? So, I mean, that's a total tangent, but
No, I know what you're talking about because as a side note, I've had Anel Shaline on the show. She was one of the State Department people with Josh Paul that quit over the Gaza stuff.
well,
I've gone over this. It's
yeah,
crazy.
respect to her, and what a nightmare that was, and it's been self-defeating for both the U.S. and Israel. I mean, it's they're on such a death trip. It's a murder suicide that they
When
seem to.
Ari Emanuel, I mean, his family has like long ties to.
His father was involved with Irgun, which was one of the early Zionist terrorist groups. And there's no allegation that Dr. Emanuel, who by all accounts was a great pediatrician in Chicago, but he was also involved with Irgun in some sort of diplomatic or financial or espionage capacity. There's no one saying that he was like Menachem Begin and planning bombs in hotels, which they did, but he was involved in the group of people who did that. So the Emanuel brothers have Zionist cred all the way. So when you see Ari Emanuel, because at the same event where he called for Biden to step down, he called for Bibi Netanyahu to step down. I think he's one of the architects of this whole strategy of it's Bibi, it's bad, bad Bibi. If we can just get him and punish him for all his corruption and all his war crimes, then Israel will be back on the straight and narrow and everything will be just fine. Even Bernie Sanders goes along with this line of BS. But I think that I mean, Ari Emanuel is the king of Hollywood. I really think this guy knows messaging and media at a level that almost no one who's ever been alive does. I mean,
Can
this
I
is
comment on that real quick? I just wanted to
sure.
say, at one point, I really want people to take away by the end of this conversation is Ari Emanuel is a completely different beast when we're talking about people involved with combat sports or Hollywood. This is not, we're not talking about like Don King or that character Samuel L. Jackson played in The Great White Hype that Don King was based, that was based on Don King. We're not talking like small time carny promoter stuff. We're talking about, a power player. I mean, William Morris Endeavor, like they're connected to everyone, even
Yeah.
like an anti-Zionist like Hassan Piker. And I'm not defaming him saying this, he openly talks about it. Even WME represents him. They represent so many people, it's insane.
Yeah, Stephen A. Smith, Pat McAfee, Larry David, so many people and also not only do they represent all these people, and they were the first Hollywood agency to get into influencers also. So, but anytime you're looking at CNN or Fox or ESPN or talking heads or massively popular social media personalities, you can bet that if they're not represented by WME currently, that they might have been on a past deal or they're working with people who are currently represented with WME. That's one of the reasons nobody wants to talk about Ari Emanuel, because even if you're Hassan Piker, you're repped by his agency. Or if you're an actor like, Javier Bardem, who might not be repped by WME, they're kind of shady about, they don't have a list of here are our clients, right? But somebody like Javier Bardem, who's been very outspoken against the genocide, he's got to think, whoa, the next movie I want to make, the director might be repped by WME. The showrunner on the next TV series I want to do might be repped by WME. Any talking head that I guess show on their show might be repped with WME.
I
I
may
mean,
not be able to get a job if the movie is with Paramount. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And there's Paramount openly has a blacklist of anti-Zionist actors they will not employ. And the proof that Paramount is not a financial play is because they're currently letting Barry Weiss, who is in no way, shape, or form qualified to run a TV network. She's a blogger with some experience at the New York Times that ended badly. And they paid this enormous, ridiculous multiple for her blog that in no way, shape, or form justifies the cost. She has no television production experience, no newsroom management experience. She's never even been a newspaper editor. She's never run a TV show. Running 60 Minutes, that's a whole thing. People spend their whole careers building up to running a news magazine. And this thing is enormously profitable. It prints money. And not only that, it's been a great way to launder American propaganda, because every so often they'll do just enough journalism that the American empire doesn't like, that when they do something like slander Edward Snowden or support the Bush invasion of Iraq in 2003, they get away with it because they've got all this credibility from all the other reports they've done. It's very similar to the New York Times, and they're so desperate to quell criticism of Israel that they're destroying these incredibly powerful and subtle vehicles. I mean, the whole thing about Hasbara, which is the Israeli practice of promoting Israel internationally, which that's what they call it. It's not some, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. They talk about Hasbara. It was very nuanced and very subtle. Although they had this absolute control, like when people like Walton Mearsheimer, the scholars from the Kennedy School and the University of Chicago, who wrote a book.
Steven's actually a friend of the show.
Awesome. I mean, great. Walton Mearsheimer are just, mad respect to those guys. They put out a book documenting the Israel lobby, which is essentially AIPAC, which has now become a toxic thing that the American public is finally becoming aware of their ownership of Congress, which is not. AIPAC didn't drive that. The Supreme Court and the corporate takeover legalized bribery, starting in 1976 with Buckley versus Vallejo, which ruled that money was speech, and continuing all the way through Citizens United. And we've cultivated prostitutes instead of representatives. These are people that essentially beg corporate people for money all day so they can then rent back time on the public airwaves that we lease to the corporations for basically nothing, so that then they can own our politicians. It's a complete subversion of American politics. And AIPAC has just been one of the best players under these rules. They didn't make these rules. They were not driving, the memos. David Sirota documents all this stuff. in his books. I can't even, my memory is so shot, apologies. But it's well documented. There was this conspiracy that starts with a letter from a guy who was with the US Chamber of Commerce and later became on the Supreme Court, whose name I'm blanking on. And wrote a memo on, we've got too many fat and sassy hippie kids at colleges that are, living off the fat of the land. We've got to crush the middle class. We've got to make colleges pay for it instead of subsidized. We've got to crush this
You'll
emergent
have
left
no
wing,
argument with my listeners on this.
yeah,
They know.
consciousness. But APAC just coincidentally uh becomes extremely tight with the US government in 1960, definitely by 1967, when the U.S. Liberty is attacked and LBJ covers it up, in a way that they were not. I mean, the U.S. was always, kind of taking over from the British Empire, and the British Empire definitely started the whole Israel thing with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and but suddenly in 1967, when LBJ is president, like they can fire on a U.S. naval vessel and kill U.S. sailors, and the president's going to cover it up because of our dear friends and allies in Israel. And ever since then, and increasingly, they've had more and more control over our politics. And I think it was cinched when Clinton took over. I mean, there's a lot of people who think that George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker were the kind of like the last vestiges of the old WASP establishment. And when
Yeah, and they
Bush,
actually had a conflict with APAC, a very famous one.
big
Yeah.
ones, yeah, Baker tried, to get Israel under control, and that created this conflict. And then suddenly Ross Perot, who's got all these Zionist business connections, runs for president as an independent. And then Clinton comes in. And ever since Clinton, whether it's Clinton or Bush or Obama or Trump or Biden or Trump, we've had the same neocon foreign policy. I mean, people like
I was
Victoria
going to say
Nuland.
real quick, did you see in the Financial Times, Hillary Clinton just did an op-ed where she says, I disagree with Trump on a lot, but the only way forward for Gaza is this plan he has with the Board of Peace.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah,
She just wrote that like yesterday too, or just got published.
yeah, and I mean that's what we're dealing with here.
But I don't want to go too far afield because I had a few more
Because we
questions.
ranged wildly, and apologies,
Yeah,
but
can we go a bit longer because I did have a few more questions. I
yeah,
wanted
we
to
can go.
ask you.
We can go. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to ask you, with regards to what you've been talking about with Zionism and Israel and Ari Emanuel and all of this, what's interesting is you have all of that going on, but you also have more and more MMA fighters that are very critical of Israel, and I would say some like Jake Shields that have just crossed over into like
He started out anti-Semitic and racist.
right.
Look at
Yeah.
his tweets about Black Lives Matter, and it's so homophobic. But then recently, this is one of the things that's so confusing about this era and why the genocide has been such a crucible. You had Jake Shields, who's been this outspoken right wing, openly racist, anti Semitic, homophobic UFC fighter on the extreme right throughout the 2010s. He and Sean King, who's one of the biggest grifters associated with BLM. And there's plenty of people that were associated, like Cori Bush, the former congresswoman from Missouri, who was a legit street warrior in Ferguson protesting horrible oppression and racism and police murder. But there were all these other grifters, like the people who actually copyright the name BLM or whatever, and Sean King, allegedly has run serial grifts, fundraising off of all these things. And one day on Twitter, and I wrote about this for a site called Naked Capitalism, where I blog as Nat Wilson Turner. One day, my timeline is Jake Shields and Sean King shaking hands and being like, "Brother, we hate everything about each other, but we're both against Israel and this genocide." And I was like, "Whoa, this is, Meanwhile, the other thing on my
Has the UFC tried to deal with that at all? Like, how do they deal with the fact that?
well, here's how they tried to deal with it.
Real quick, I was gonna say, so Dana White's whole policy is like free speech, free speech.
That's what he says now. That's not been his historical policy, but under TKO.
He's having to deal with a lot of bad PR due to anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc.
And this is where I think Ari Emanuel is using the UFC as kind of a sock puppet. He's not a fight fan. He doesn't care about this. And I think he's always looked down on UFC fans. And I think he kind of misread the UFC fan base as this troglodyte right-wing slobathon that he could use as a vehicle for his dealings with Donald Trump. Stroke of genius, but extremely cynical. And like, so when Bryce Mitchell came out, and Bryce Mitchell, for those who don't know, is a reasonably almost a top tier UFC fighter who, not ever going to be a champ. Kind of a sweet kid from Arkansas. Sometimes he'll go on these Jesus riffs or talk about the people, and you'll be like, oh, what a sweethearted, bold speaking kid. He also is a guy who ripped his testicles off with a power drill accidentally one day. So we're not dealing with a rocket scientist here.
Well, hasn't he also like made pro-Hitler comments?
That's what I was coming to. He's also a flat earther, and and one day on his podcast he just starts freestyling about how Hitler had his reasons and he wasn't such a bad guy and all this stuff that would have absolutely ended anybody's career in a previous era because it was stupid and horrible. And I mean, nobody should hate Hitler more than right-wingers and Germans, because what was the outcome of Hitler? It was to destroy Germany, ultimately, and shame them by committing this massive, and it wasn't just the 6 million Jews, it was also the 6 million, Roma peoples and homosexuals and socialists and the 27 million Russians, and then all the war casualties and the millions and millions and millions and millions of Germans who died in his stupid, aggressive wars. But Bryce just starts freestyling about, what a great guy Hitler was. So the UFC response is to book him against this guy named Jean Silva, who's a rabidly pro-Zionist Brazilian Bolsonaro backing fighter. So we're supposed, and Ari Emanuel's plan seemed to be that the fans will rally around the good guy against bad guy Hitler-loving Bryce Mitchell. But the quote unquote good guy is a backer of the fascist, former president of Brazil, and just a complete right-wing tool. Both choices are complete right wing, except the guy's wearing a Star David pin and talking about his love for Israel, which Bolsonaro also. I mean, the new right wing president of Colombia is going to move their embassy to Jerusalem and stuff. This alignment of US backed Latin American fascists with Israel is long standing. I mean, they helped him hunt down Che Guevara back in the day, and there's all these like Dr. Aaron Good at American Exception is somebody I highly recommend you check out. I can't endorse
He's
everything
been on the
he
show
says.
as well.
Awesome. I'm honored to be in good company with your guest list. But he's documented how John Angleton at the CIA, who was the boss of not the boss, but the number 2 or 3 guy at the CIA in the 50s and 60s, he used Mossad as sort of for his really dirty work. When he couldn't even, stuff he didn't even want the CIA guys who he managed to know about, he would use Mossad. Anyway, so Ari's plan was to, Jean Silva's going to whip this guy Bryce Mitchell and everybody, wave their flags. But one of the biggest MMA YouTube personalities is this guy, MMA Guru, who's another one of these people who engages in open racism and fighter hating. And I mean, he's a true fan of the sport. And he's this British kid, and I mean, I'm very conflicted because basically I feel like we're in a genocide. It's all hands on deck. And anybody who's against putting the fire out, like if your house is on fire and some firemen show up to help you, you're not really worried, well, is this guy a wife beater? Is this guy an embezzler? Or, even if some cops show up to help you, which will never happen. But if, you might be like, oh my God, the house is on fire. We need all the help we can get. And so MMA Guru like openly supported Bryce Mitchell because of the Hitler comments, and and has done all these crossovers, did a fishing trip with him in Arkansas. And so whatever Ari Emanuel's plan was, it ended up making Bryce Mitchell the baby face, which is what pro wrestlers call the good guy, not the heel, which is what pro wrestlers call the bad guy.
Just because Mitchell was anti-Israel.
Basically, yes. Yeah. I mean, and also, fans like him. And I mean, Jean Silva has fans too. He's a good fighter. I don't want to disrespect his talents, but
well, it's sort of like the situation, not to interrupt you, but it's like the situation with and I wanted to get into him because I know he had an incident at Freedom 250. It's
Sean
sort of like
Strickland.
Sean Strickland, because you know what? I always tell people I have a soft spot for the guy. Like when he cried on Theo Vaughn's show and talked about trauma, I was like, I like this guy. Or when he talks about how much he hates Andrew Tate and how Andrew Tate's not a good role model for men, I'm like, yeah, Sean Strickland's right about that. But then Strickland will say something completely off the wall, and I would be like, what is wrong with you, man?
Or homophobic or
Right?
transphobic
No,
or
that's what I mean. He'll say
yeah,
really
he
transphobic stuff or homophobic stuff or
yeah.
racist, anti-Islam, and I'm just like, oh, why do you do that, Sean?
Yeah, well, it's the American educational system. We don't have one. And it's also this American culture war pattern where they, you guys wear blue t-shirts, you guys wear red t-shirts, now y'all fight. Meanwhile, APAC is and the AI bros and the crypto bros are funding all of them, and people like Ari Emanuel and Egan Durbin and all these other billionaires. I mean, the UAE and Israel have been, and now it's open that they're open allies, but they've been running this secret. We're not really, oh, we're Arabs and you're Jews. It's a bitter divide, but wink, wink, wink. We're totally integrated. And the Saudis were part of that for most of the past 30 years. But now we're seeing the UAE has suddenly cut a deal with Iran, even though they quit OPEC. I mean, things are fluid right now. I mean,
Right.
we're in a political blender and everybody's getting shaken. And but my main point is that there people like Sean Strickland and Bryce Mitchell are perfect dupes for this culture war BS. And although they're not quite perfect because they're uncontrolled, like the UFC would prefer that Sean Strickland not be such a staunch advocate for workers' rights and for better pay for fighters and be such a critic of Israel, Epstein, and Trump. Like he was like, I don't want to go to your Epstein party, and that's not what they want. But then, of course, the guy shows up at the event anyway because he's desperate to be included and get the shine from the publicity around the
Well,
event.
I think, yeah, I was gonna say real quick, Strickland strikes me as he's a bit of I think in Britain they call it a wind-up merchant. He knows how to stir things to get
Yeah,
publicity for himself because I like Strickland as a fighter, but he's not
I
necessarily
hate him as a fighter because he's so
well,
boring. But
I
anyway,
was gonna say he's not the most exciting fighter, but he
yeah,
knows if I talk this way, I can get attention.
yeah, yeah. And Colby Covington was the guy who first started that. Another guy with a really boring fight style who discovered that who sussed out that the UFC wanted right-wing coded fighters, and he really played that up. But they used him like a dish rag and threw him out. And then when he didn't get his shot, when he didn't get included at the UFC White House and his UFC career was over, he came out and said, "I just did that for the lulz and the attention," which may or may not be true.
Do you think that they are that UFC is kind of perturbed by Strickland? Because I get what you're saying, but at the same time, he makes some money, doesn't he? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, again, they've got this quote unquote free speech policy. And again, also, I think Ari Emanuel is deliberately marketing the UFC as a controversial right-wing coded brand. I think Ari Emanuel was ahead of his time in 2016. Like it's known he was ahead of his time on streaming. Um,
well, you even
and
see it
also,
real quick, not to interrupt you, but you even see it with Pat McAfee, right? He's talked about, I want Pat McAfee to be the next Sylvester Stallone. I represent him. And what does he do? He uses WrestleMania as a sizzle reel, basically, for
yeah,
Pat McAfee. Like he's
yeah.
using his own products like WWE to help his other clients out in other endeavors.
And he's even letting WWE performers talk about Mark Shapiro and Ari Emanuel as the bad guys. They're sort of trying to come around and use them as the way they used to use Vince McMahon, since Triple H is so obviously not the evil mastermind behind anything. And Dana White and Triple H are very similar. They're just frontmen. They're like if you look into Dana White, and I've followed this guy for decades, he's a great TV producer. He's very passionate about the UFC's TV product. He claims in court that he hasn't been involved in fighter negotiations since 2018, although there's much documented proof that that's not the case. With fighters have published text messages between him and their managers in 2019 and stuff. And currently TKO or WME is in court, Endeavor is in court claiming that they're not actually involved in the day-to-day management of the UFC. Which I asked a lawyer I knew about that. I was just like, can you believe this crap? They're claiming they don't run the company that they run. Like Mark Shapiro at every quarterly report is talking about, yeah, we're putting more branding on the octagon, or we're not going back to cities unless they pay us big, like screw the city, the C market towns that build us. we're only going to Perth, Australia if they pay through the nose. St. Louis, if you want the UFC and WWE, pay through the nose. Like they openly brag about how they're micromanaging the thing and all the people they fired from the production side, et cetera. And then their lawyers are filing this thing in court saying that they don't have any role in the UFC management, which I was just shocked and outraged. But I told a lawyer I know about this, and she was just like, well, when you don't have a case on the facts, you try to make a case on the technicalities. And she wasn't shocked at all. She was like, that's legal 101. They've already paid one $375 million settlement to fighters because of their illegal monopolistic practices.
I was
They've
going to
got,
say, aren't the fighters, they're independent contractors, so they kind of
of
can get screwed
course,
easily. Yeah. Same with WWE.
except they're treated like employees, like they have to follow all these rules that the UFC sets.
It's the
And
same with WWE then. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like Amazon or anybody else. I mean, this is how corporate America works. But my point was that Ari Emanuel was kind of genius, I think, in sussing out that young, particularly white young American men, were kind of losers in the Obama era and in the woke era. And he figured out that not only had Trump won this election, but the UFC had this big appeal to this demo that I think he sort of misunderstood, but sort of was right about. I mean, because even I was sort of relieved when Trump, I was obviously, I didn't vote for Trump. I was totally against him, but I couldn't vote for Kamala Harris because genocide, right? So, and I mean, I'm in Texas anyway, so my electoral vote goes to the Republican no matter what I do. So it wasn't like I was in a swing state. But there was an element of relief, like F Kamala Harris, like F woke. Like I'm so sick of what I, as an old Gen X crusty white dude, view as like smart ass millennials who want to lecture me on, well, actually the word is this, or, don't say,
We're
all this
just
word.
only focusing on identity politics and excluding any
And
class analysis. Yeah.
exactly. And their identity politics is solely semantic. They're just interested in word police and perfectly
Well, it's like
happy
the
to.
Palestinians don't get identity politics.
No, yeah, and and what we saw in New York this week was so exciting because you have a candidate who just got the congressional nomination who knocked off the head of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and their ads were this woman posted F Kamala Harris on social media. Like they sent that mailer out all over that district, and you know what? Nobody cared
And she
because those
still won.
people,
Yeah.
yeah, she won. And so, anyway, but Ari was ahead of that. But now I think he's kind of behind the curve.
Real quick. So do you think Ari isn't necessarily driven entirely by politics and it's more about, well, I can use this as a vehicle and then just dispose of it when necessary? Because it's interesting how you're
Yeah,
describing it because sound
absolutely.
it sounds like Ari Emanuel and Dana White may be kind of playing two different games because I thought it was interesting. I think it was a month or so ago that Dana White did that appearance with Governor Josh Shapiro. And it seemed like the only reason he did that, other than announcing that event in Philadelphia, was to say, "Hey, see, I talk to Democrats.
Yeah,
Democrats are welcome in MMA world too." But I mean, it rings hollow.
absolutely. But one thing to keep in mind about Dana White is this, and the Hollywood Reporter, I believe, covered this in depth. This is a guy who spends almost all of his time gambling in casinos. He's also a guy who has, through documented court cases, been blackmailed for his relationship. He's a married man, but had a relationship with a stripper that he took to Brazil, and then her husband tried to blackmail him, and he sued. The guy did jail time, and then tried to sue Dana White. When it didn't go right, and that's when the case was revealed. Dana White is not a smart or thoughtful man. He's shrewd. He knows TV production. At one time, he was passionate about MMA fighting, but the only thing he seems to really be passionate about these days is hanging out with the Nelk boys and these other young influencers. He's like any 56-year-old who's spending all this time with these 20-something influencers.
Was it one of their big interviewers, an influencer,
Aiden
Neat Drama?
Ross. Yeah, Nina Drama is the one. I was actually blanking on her name, but yeah, that's what he wants to do, is be on shows with Aiden Ross and Nina Drama and hanging out and talking about Dana White and how great Dana White is. Dana White is not a sophisticated political actor. Dana White is not an educated man. Dana White doesn't think in terms. I'm guarantee you that it was not Dana White that booked that Josh Shapiro thing. That he was told to do that and
Do
he
you think
did
it
it.
may have been Ari Emanuel behind that?
Or Ari's people, absolutely. I guarantee you. I don't have any evidence.
Do
Good.
you see the Shapiro thing as a very yeah, I think it was a very blatant play to say, hey, we're not all just we're not, it's not all
Sure.
MAGA. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you notice, Josh Shapiro is a massive Zionist. He may be a Democrat, but he's just like one of these like Hillary Clinton that they're all on board with the neocon foreign policy and
Establishment
Zionism.
Democrat. Yeah.
Yeah, establishment Democrat, and so somebody Ari Emanuel's very comfortable with. And yeah, and I think that even though it was WWE and UFC that made Ari Emanuel a billionaire. It was not his Hollywood empire because Hollywood's basically tanked in the 2020s. I mean, COVID killed the theatrical thing. That they ran the franchises into the ground with too many Marvel Comics movies and too many Harry Potters and too much Star Wars, excuse me, and all this stuff. And they killed the golden goose, and they're trying to replace writers with AI and actors with AI and all this gross crap. He became a billionaire off the back of UFC and WWE, but he is not a fight guy. He is not a wrestling guy. He's not a boxing guy. He just sees a money opportunity. And I think he cares about politics deeply. I mean, it's not just him and Rom. There's a third brother, Zeke, who Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, who was one of the architects of Biden's COVID policy, or at least involved in some Biden COVID panels, and also was one of the first critics of Biden's COVID policy. Classic Emanuel family playing both sides of the street stuff. Like he's
Well, they're laughing all the way to the bank while they play both sides.
exactly. And like to me, like it's also notable how he's helped the Ellisons assemble this Zionist media empire using Middle Eastern Gulf state Arab financing. You're not seeing a lot of other Zionist billionaires, of which there are plenty, coming in and helping the Ellisons. It's it's Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia that own 25% of this new WBD. That is curious to me. I mean, that is really interesting, especially when you think, I mean, the politics in that region are so backstabby and two-faced. I mean, like in 2017 or 2018, Jared Kushner green lighted a plan by the UAE and Saudi Arabia to blockade Qatar, which is an act of war. And it was only when I think it was, I can't remember, it was Mad Dog or Rex Tillerson, one of the adults in the first Trump regime said, no, we can't do that because we've got a massive Air Force base in Qatar. I think the Iranians have fixed that for us. But at the time, we had this massive Air Force base there in Qatar. So two of the three of them were basically at war with the third one in 2017. And this year, the UAE and the Saudi proxies have been openly at war in Yemen. They've been openly at war in the Saudi proxies and UAE proxies have been on opposite sides in the wars in Sudan and Somalia for a long time, even though they had been aligned on Yemen from 2015 until this year. And obviously the politics are tense between the UAE and Saudi throughout the Iran war, the Ramadan war, whatever you want to call it,
Right. So
because
this can go in multiple directions, I think is what
yeah, but
yeah.
Ari Emanuel is the one maybe was involved in helping that finance thing. Again, I can't
Puppet
prove that.
master figure.
He's absolutely a puppet master. I mean, that's what he does professionally. And also look at people like Larry David, who, Seinfeld is this infamous Zionist, and people are starting to hate him for it. It's starting to damage his brand. Larry David has very elegantly distanced himself from that. If you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, and he's a genius, that's part of my pain about this is I love, American Jewish culture. It's so much of our heritage, the Marx Brothers, on and on
Well,
and
yeah,
on.
and I think both of us would agree. Like, you know, Jewish and Zionist are two different things.
Absolutely. And some of the best anti-Zionists, some of my heroes, Norman Finkelstein, Aaron Mate and his dad, and so many, Katie Halper, so many of our brothers and sisters in this fight against this genocide are Jewish leading figures. I mean, Jews have resisted Zionism since Einstein and Hannah Arendt wrote essays, op-eds against Israel in the 40s. And during World War II, the Zionists were notorious for being terrible to the victims of and survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto, et cetera, et cetera. Zionists are basically fascists. They've always gotten along with Nazis. I mean, there were SS guys who literally, like, dude's resume reads Nazi, Germany, Egypt, Israel, dies, and everybody shows up to his funeral. Like, what? Like, there's always been this weird, fascists of all types seem to get along, and they, well, you kill our people over there, but that drives them to us, and it's a win-win. And it's and before Epstein and Jimmy Savile in England, I didn't believe in any of this kind of mass pedophile ring conspiracy crap I used to hear in the 90s. I just think this stuff was ridiculous. But at this point, I'm just like, well, there's plenty of documented evidence of lots of elite pedophile rings, and
Well, that even goes with the whole, I used to laugh when, people younger than me would say, "Oh, everything's a psyop." But then like I said, I saw the thing they did with Pat McAfee in the WrestleMania, and I'm like, it's literally a psyop. It's literally a way to make a sizzle reel for one of your other clients that has nothing to do with wrestling. We're just going to throw them in there for a sizzle reel. I'm like, oh, maybe there are psyops everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it was
It does
America.
seem to be what WME specializes in.
I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, you know, Trotsky and Goebbels learned their trade from reading books written by American advertising executives, who weren't Jewish, some of them. William Burroughs' uncle, Ivy Lee, was one of the pioneers of evil PR. So, it's not like Jews have some special PR magic. It's just that the elites have the money to use these techniques that people in the communications fields have crafted over centuries, but particularly in the modern, broadcast mass media era, and now into the internet era. And so, yes, we should be looking for conspiracies. I mean, a conspiracy is just three people planning a crime, or two people planning a crime. People get convicted of criminal conspiracies every day, so that's just been one of these tropes that the mainstream establishment has used in the US. Oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. And I mean, and look at the way they edit Wikipedia. So many people are conspiracy theorists that are actually good reporters. People are getting arrested right now. ICE just arrested somebody in a voting booth because they posted on social media something that was a proven fact about who shot who in Minneapolis. There's a real, I mean, we're in a crisis point. We're millions are dying in the Ukraine, millions are dying in Gaza, hundreds of tens of thousands or whatever are dying in Iran and all over the Middle East. They're looking to start wars in East Asia, where obviously something is going on, something big. And who are the power players? I mean, you look back at World War II, and IBM and Ford and the Bank of England, they did business with the Nazis all the way to the end. I mean, like, the financial stuff we've done to Putin and Russia since 2022 is stuff they didn't even do to Hitler back in the day. And yet there's still oligarchs. In fact, there's a Russian oligarch who owns a chunk of the UFC. Ari Emanuel has relationships, and I'm blanking on the name, Kirill, and it's a Russian name, so it's Kirill Dmitriev, I believe is his name, but I
Okay.
could be wrong on that. But look this guy up, because he is the guy, basically, when Kushner and Witkoff go to Anchorage to negotiate with Russia, Dmitriev is with Putin, and Dmitriev owns a piece of the UFC, or business entities related to him do, but they haven't been able to do anything because of the sanctions since 2022. And the
Oh,
UFC also has big relationships in China and has had big plans to expand into China. They've had a Chinese, female champ, and they've got a mixed record at international expansion. Like, they were big in Brazil, and now they're not so big in Brazil. They've flopped in Mexico repeatedly. They've flopped in Japan despite buying Pride in 2007 or no, 2009. I can't remember what year
that
it
was
was
such a
exactly, but
devastating moment, by the way, when Pride went under.
yeah, it was.
I
And
mean,
that was right when it was.
I'm one of those weirdos that occasionally watches Ryzen, but it's not the same.
No, but it's still cool. They still put on great fights.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's yeah, I obviously I can go on for hours about
Well,
this
just
crap.
real briefly. So the things that happened at Freedom 250, we briefly mentioned it. Just real quickly, what happened with Strickland?
Strickland showed up to one of the pressers in a hoodie and claims that the security, whether it was Secret Service or DHS, I don't know, it was some sort of, or it might have been DC cops, that somebody was like, "Hey, you can't have a hoodie here. Take the hoodie off." And he was like, "Hey, I'm a UFC champ. It's going to cause a ruckus if I reveal my identity." And then he was forced to take the hoodie off, and then it created a ruckus. I don't know if I believe that or not. Like you said, Strickland's a rage baiter, and everything's a psyop. And there were some other
Yeah,
kerfuffles.
UFC may have even known that he was going to do that. Who knows?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. But again, they kind of let these guys work as independent operators, and it's a lot easier to give these guys free, quote unquote, freedom of speech, and let them operate and do their own shenanigans without planning. I mean, generally, it's so hard to pull off conspiracies. It's so hard to pull off anything in an organized fashion that I tend to. I mean, my thinking before we learned about Epstein and all these documented conspiracies was, yeah, it's more often stupidity than and chaos and all against all than it is some kind of organized thing. Like I always thought Alex Jones, I'm from Austin. I've known Alex Jones since the 90s. I remember when he was hanging out at Access Television and didn't even have his own show on Access TV. I always thought that these people were seeking some kind of higher power to believe in, like, oh, the world is fallen and evil and terrifying, but at least we can believe in the lizard people, that they're in control and they have a plan. And I was always like, sorry, dude, there ain't no lizard people. It's just a madhouse and it's chaos all the way down. But now I'm kind of like, well, there sure are some families. I mean, if you look at the wealth in Europe, it sure doesn't change hands over the centuries. And obviously the Rothschilds are the ones who get the bad name, but Europe's history of anti-Semitism is just so endless and convoluted and awful. Um, but the Rothschilds are a real thing. I mean, I've read Neil Ferguson's books on them, which are a total shine job, and no more to be trusted than the guy that wrote the bios of Alexander Hamilton and J.P. Morgan, whose name I'm blanking on. But anyway, there was
So
and
Chernow.
people, yeah, turnout, and there's always money to shine billionaires. There's all if you're Matt Iglesias or Ezra Klein or Ben Shapiro or whatever, if you want to be a talking head, if you say what the power structure once said, there's always work for
You're going
you.
to get backing.
Yeah. And I'm one of these stupid assholes that never gets backing because I'm always running my
You and
mouth.
me both.
Yeah. And I mean, I worked at Vox Media before it was Vox Media, and I got sort of a second row seat of watching the whole creation of Vox.com and the Ezra and Iglesias team, and then watch those guys then, take the bag and just walk away. The same thing happened with Ariel Helwani, basically. He was at Vox, and he's at ESPN, and he's back at Vox, and now he's independent, but he's actually backed by Yahoo and Apollo Global Management, which is again backed by all this Arab money.
I think a lot of people try to treat him like he's the big journalist going up against
Dana White.
Dana White, but
Yeah.
at the same time, I mean, the dude's, I don't know.
His career was made because he was Dana White's favorite shine boy. Like when they bought Strikeforce in 2011, Josh Gross was about to break the story for, I believe, ESPN. It might have been Sports Illustrated, whoever he was working for at the time. And Dana flew Ariel out so Ariel could scoop him on it. Like that happened to us all the time at Bloody Elbow, and being under the same corporate head as Helwani. Like they had three MMA sites for some reason, and they were all successful for a long time. Bloody Elbow, MMA Mania, and MMA Fighting. And shout outs to my friends at those sites, and fu to my enemies at those sites. But watching that, there were times when like Gillette wouldn't advertise because Bloody Elbow was on the blacklist, and so they did things like with our Google traffic, like Bloody Elbow had to tag every fighter's name and send it to the MMA fighting fighter database and Ariel Helwani's site, right? So they did all these things and they promoted me in 2015 to management and then told me, we don't want you writing. You shouldn't be writing anymore. You should just be doing some Zoom meetings and spreadsheets. And I was like, that'll take me about 10 hours a week. That's great. Great. Perfect. Don't write anymore, and, and, it's been a fascinating ride. And Helwani is definitely an op. Like the guy's a stooge and an imbecile, and has no moral comprehension. I mean, I
Did you
kind
see
of
his interview recently with the wrestler MJF, where he like was chastising MJF for not being a Zionist anymore?
I did see that, and Ariel is still going back to the anti-Semitism well. Like that's as far as he can think. And in Ariel's defense, he's a great MMA reporter. If this was normal days, if this was the 60s or the 70s, he would have been interviewing fighters when they came out of the cage and done a great job. Um, but because he's living in this cynical, opportunistic, fallen, end times capitalism era, he's an opportunist and he's done these things. And the only reason he got on the outs with Dana White was he couldn't resist scooping a fight announcement. It wasn't because he was doing crusading journalism on behalf of fighter rights or, digging up dirt. He just wanted to scoop on a fight announcement. Like that was all it was. And then when he becomes this well publicized martyr, because he had 1 million Twitter followers and he gets banned by the UFC. That was a news story, and people at ESPN and ABC and all these entities wanted to interview him about it. And he worked for ESPN, although he tearfully revealed on camera that his checks for his work for ESPN came from the UFC, which is absolutely journalism 101. You don't do that. If you're on camera and your mic says ESPN, but you're getting paid by the UFC, you're lying. You're lying. You're not being a journalist. You're being a shill. And this is, and when I worked at Vox and he did that, all of us were made to look bad by that. And I couldn't even get a meeting so we could just ask the guy, dude, what WTF? Like, what are you doing? Like, if you did that, why are you revealing this on a live stream while you're crying? Like, keep your fucking zip. Like, what are you doing? Like, I can't believe you did that in the first place. And I can't believe how and the only reason he announced it allegedly is because the UFC was about to announce it, but he never did anything for Josh Gross or Jonathan Snowden or so many journalists that been blackballed, everybody at Bloody Elbow. He never did a peep for anybody else. It was just about him. And the guy's a complete cynic. And I mean, watching the trajectory of Luke Thomas and Ariel Helwani is really fascinating because Luke is becoming now this political figure. Like the Substack he dropped yesterday declaring the death of the centrist Democrat brand. I mean, it was hot fire and I loved it, but I'm also like, yeah, but the DSA has been organizing in New York for a decade and they haven't done that nationally. Like, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Like, we have so much work to do and we might not even have a functioning republic by the time that organization is done. I mean, there's a real live chance that the next election is going to be decided not at the ballot box, and maybe at gunpoint. So I'm excited about Mom Donnie's win and everything, but anyway, but my point was that Luke has got some sense. Like Luke is a political animal. Actually, when I met him and brought him on at Bloody Elbow, he was working for the legendary Republican consultant who coined the term death tax. And now I'm forgetting, he's famous for having a toupee. I can't remember the dude's name, but Luke didn't like doing that. So he wanted to write about MMA and, we built this site that was very successful. And then he went on to work for MMA Fighting when they were brought on at Vox. And, he's had this great, brilliant career and I haven't, but that's neither here nor there. But the difference between Luke and Ariel Helwani is really telling because MMA and wrestling is all Helwani can do. He is not a thoughtful, educated person. He just is a good fight reporter and a fight fan and a wrestling fan. And I kind of feel for the guy because he's way in over his head. And also, like, his cousin is Godside or whatever the guy's effing name is. That's a massive.
That's his cousin. Oh,
or his
God.
uncle. Yeah. Like, so Ariel, is Zionist family, raised Zionist, which I have a certain amount of sympathy for the Israelis because they've been Hitler youth for 80 years. I mean, Hitler only had a decade and a half to brainwash people. The Zionists in Israel, again, Zionism was founded the same time as Banderaism in Ukraine or fascism in Italy or Phalangism in Spain or Nazism in Germany. these are the fascists. They've had 80 years to brainwash every kid growing up in Israel, and they bring all the American kids over and brainwash them. And it's like there's nobody I respect more than anti-Zionists like Israelis, like Alan Mizrahi or Owen. I'll get his name wrong in an
Ori
anti-Semitic.
Goldberg.
Yeah, yeah, Ori Goldberg.
Ori's
Like
another friend of the show. He was just
yeah.
on last
Oh
week.
man, dude, I need to catch up with your show. It's like very few people can be raised in a indoctrinated propagandistic. Like these are literally the people, the famous photo of the guy not Hitler saluting at the Nazi rally. That's a brave, that's the White Rose movement. I mean, these are legends that can overcome that kind of training and indoctrination, and not just to realize it, wow, this everything I've been told is a lie and we're the bad guys, but then to publicly come out and speak against it. When you've served, like Mizrahi served in the IDF, he knows what they do to people. He might have been in some of these horror jails where they mutilate people and let Jewish Dr. Mengeles experiment on Palestinians. Like, wow. Anyway, that's a total side point. But so Ariel Helwani is not one of those people. Who is? Like 1% of 1%? Like Ariel Helwani is just a normal asswipe, who's a good reporter and an opportunistic careerist. But he's a personal enemy and a jackass and an opportunist. He doesn't care about the fighters or the sport, and he just cares about making money off the sport.
So I know I have to let you keep going, but there was just really, really briefly. How does Shane Gillis fit into this Freedom 250 thing? I guess he responded to something that was said, or the
I
Josh
mean,
Hockett thing.
yeah, he basically said, I think that's kind of over the line there, brother, and then got some pushback. And I'm not like a massive Shane Gillis fan.
I like Gillis more than a lot of the other people involved in that.
I've seen some of his comedy, and sometimes it's funny. My wife really loves comedy, but Nate Bargatze's the guy who got for showing up at the UFC. Like he got some serious pushback for being there at UFC White House, and his brand is, vanilla toaster jokes and crap. Like he's a Seinfeld style observational, comedian, and I basically thought he was funny one or two specials, and the third one I was like, yeah, whatever. You're talking about t-shirts, dude. Like, but Shane Gillis apparently like distanced himself and then got some backlash. But I'm not an expert
So it was
on anything
so
really.
Hockett just came out right after, or was it Hockett?
It was Josh Hockett who came out and said Michelle Obama's a man, and maybe, I mean, somebody came out and said, I don't respect that because you're at the White House and you're disrespecting a former first lady. And she was my first lady. I didn't vote for her, but she was my first lady. And shut up with that BS. And I can't remember if that was Shane Gillis or some other influencer. As you can tell, I smoked my memory in the 90s. So, and COVID didn't do me any favors either. So I can't remember.
The other thing that happened was, I know we don't have a lot of time to cover it, but I guess there was a foiled so-called domestic terror plot.
And that one, interestingly, most of the American domestic terror plots, if you look into it, were completely FBI. FBI finds a developmentally disabled Islamic kid and befriends them and tells them, hey, radicalizes them and then tells them where to buy the weapons and like hatches a whole plot for them and then arrests them and persecutes them. This one seems to have been a genuine, from what we can tell, and I don't trust anything coming out of, it's not Kash Patel's FBI, but whoever's running the FBI. I don't trust anything that comes from government sources, especially in the Trump regime. Um, but it does appear like this was a genuine attempt to do some possibly anti-Zionist terrorist acts at the White House event, and we just had an attempted assassination at the White House press corps, whatever that thing is called, the comedy night the White House and the press corps do. We had a guy literally try to run in there with a gun. Um, this appears to have been organically planned, but it was all done online. So of course, Claude or whoever was ratting them out the whole time they were, like, guys, don't use AI. Don't use Gmail or Google Docs to plan your revolution. Like, how stupid can you be? and it was nipped in the bud, fortunately. But some kind of attack like that was a big fear of mine and Zach Arnold, who works with me at the MMA Draw, because we were just like, they're going to have this massive event at the White House, and then they tamped it down to where it was only a few thousand people. But even still, having a few thousand people at the White House and then another 10 or 20,000 people near the White House is a massive security challenge. And as we've seen, as we saw in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, the Secret Service ain't what it used to be, you know? And like the assassination attempt at the press corps thing, did you see the footage of Kash Patel standing around like a dumbass for like an hour and a half?
Well, that's what I was gonna say next. Is like this whole. I mean, everything with this administration has been I'm just going to swear at this point. I don't care. It's been a shit show, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
the entirety of Freedom 250 seemed like a shit show. I mean, you were talking before I think we got on air about there was a physician that said, "Oh, this fighter can't." He failed a vision test, and the referee is just like, "No, we're going to send a blind fighter in there."
That happened in the headlining fight on the card. That was the main event of the card. And Ilya Topuria, who was fighting Justin Gaethje for he had moved up from featherweight and fighting for lightweight title, and fighting to unify the belt or whatever. I can't keep. I don't bother to keep up with the interim belts. They pull so much BS with their titles and stuff. But Topuria was hurt, and the ref asked him, and was cut up, and I believe had a broken orbital bone. Uh, and the ref asked for a doctor. The doctor does the vision exam. He fails it. I've seen a million vision exams done by doctors in the corner. Fighters almost always lie that they can see because they want to keep fighting, right? Fighters almost never say, I can't see. He said, I can't see. And he also, you could watch him failing the vision test. It was like watching somebody fail a DWI walk. Like, dude, you're not following the guy's fingers. And they let him go fight another round. He was overruled by the referee, which technically has the
They both
ruling.
worked for that association of
Okay, yeah. If you want to
boxing.
get, I mean, I mean, we've already. I'll go as long as you want, but
I know we've gone long. I'm sorry. I just want to get. Yeah.
I mean, obviously I can talk about this crap all day, and this is great fun. But so there was a whole other like conspiracy within conspiracy. So DC, the District of Columbia, has a perfectly functional athletic commission. Anybody who's lived in DC or traveled to DC and seen a boxing match knows that they have a perfectly workable athletic commission that can manage a combat sport event. They were not allowed to be involved. And instead, this thing called the ABC, and forgive me, I'm blanking on the Association of Boxing Commissions, which is a meta organization that doesn't really have any regulatory role. It's where the commissions get together and agree on what rule sets they're going to follow and, what referees are good and stuff like that. And the ref and doctor were working directly for the ABC rather than the DC commission. And then coincidentally, engineer an outcome that results in an extra round of fight for Paramount and UFC when the fighter was too clearly hurt. Even though, I mean, he put on a fearless brave. I mean, I'm not going to diss the guy because he nearly still won the fight in the third round. The guy has such power in his hands and so dangerous that even blind, he was still dangerous and nearly won the fight, right? I mean, he came much closer in the first two rounds, but the commission like visibly failed right before your eyes. And it wasn't even the commission that should be doing it. I mean, it's just like
Well, it should have
everything.
been the local DC
It
athletic
should have
commission.
been the local DC Athletic Commission. And that doctor, the one who was overruled, we didn't know who he was at first, but it turns out he's a veteran doctor who's done tons of events there in DC, knows his business, knows how to do a vision test, should not have been overruled. And the real tell is that the fight was ended when the corner threw in its towel, when Topuria's brother threw in the towel and said, my brother cannot keep fighting. That never happens in MMA. Never, ever, ever. MMA corners, I have chastised them for over a decade for not throwing in the towel when your man is hurt or your woman is hurt. Like that, you see it in boxing. They throw in the towel in boxing, but just the ethos of MMA is we get brain damage in practice. We go out on our shield. My brother would rather be a martyr than quit, which is stupid and wrong. And it'd be one thing if he was getting generational money. If Topuria was making the 9 or 10 figures that he earned by headlining the most notorious UFC event in history.
Right.
It
This got
wasn't the
more
most
publicity
profitable.
than the UFC has ever gotten before.
Yeah, yes, it absolutely did. And much of it was negative. Much of it was looky-loo. And some of the shows I did were definitely sort of liberals that were looking to bag on the UFC and had no interest in it otherwise.
Or just to be honest, it goes back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation. I didn't want to do this. I saw a lot of people just bagging on MMA as like, and I don't like that because I think you would agree with this. I've talked to people like Shannon Knapp and even MMA fighters. I think these people should be taken seriously as athletes.
Absolutely. This is the most difficult, dangerous sport on the planet. It
And it's a
is
sport. It's not
it's a
just fighting,
sport.
it's a sport.
Yeah, and I was so sad when I saw Joyce Carol Oates, who I revere as a boxing writer. I'm not a fan of her fiction. I love her on Twitter, and as a boxing writer, she's right up there with George Plimpton or Norman Mailer or any of her generational peers that were legit writers who moonlighted in boxing. But her piece on boxing is absolutely foundational to me and the way I cover combat sports. And she comes out and is like, I don't know anything about this MMA stuff. Is it real or fake like pro wrestling? And I was just like, oh, old lady, like, come
But
on,
didn't that also happen allegedly with Eric Trump?
Well, that's a whole nother thing. And yeah, we could have spent the whole episode on this. So right before the fight, Daniel Cormier, a former UFC champ and currently comment announcer, ringside, works with Joe Rogan on every fight, came out and tweeted and had screenshots that seemed to be from Eric Trump and were saying, hey, wink, wink, are any of these rigged? Like the same family that's been betting on the oil market before allegedly, before, every Axios report that comes out and says we've got, 39 different times they've announced we've got a peace deal. And it seemed like Eric Trump wanted to do some insider trading or betting on the fights and was trying to get very sloppy and inconsiderate. And Cormier, my initial thinking was, is this real? Because it was deleted before I even saw it. But multiple MMA reporters I respect, Damon Martin among others, said this was real. This was on his feed. He's not denying it was on his feed. He's claiming he was hacked,
Yeah, but it's
but
one tweet.
it was
You lost
exactly.
control for one single tweet.
We've seen this thing before. I mean, I was about to bag on Joy Reid, but now I love her because she's come out against the genocide. But remember when Joy Reid had the whole time machine that lied on my blog? Like what? Like the claims were explosive that Eric Trump had approached the UFC commentator looking for inside information so he could bet on the fight and was wondering if any of them are rigged.
Right, with the wink wink. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, which shows the ignorance and opportunism of the Trump family and the entitlement that you think 5 minutes before the event you can approach a guy whose entire career would be destroyed if he were caught telling you inside scoop on a fight. Like there's, to my knowledge, very few rigged fights in MMA history. There have been some, but what's more common is people know somebody's hurt in camp or that kind of thing. We've seen tons of fights where the betting lines move real weird because a coach who happens to be a professional tout making more of his money doing tips on UFC betting than he does
I
as an
think it's
MMA
happened
coach.
much more in I mean, there's like work shoots that have happened in Japan, like whole promotions that were based around that, but that's a very different.
That's a different thing, but there have been fights in the UFC where going back to that. I mean, it's two guys in a ring. If I decide I'm going to throw this fight, how are you going to stop me? It's two guys and a referee. It's easy to fix an MMA fight. It's hard to get away with it though. But like the point about respecting these athletes, this is the decathlon of combat sports. You have to have at least a passing familiarity with the techniques of freestyle wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, judo, boxing, Muay Thai kickboxing, French savate, catch as catch can wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You have to know so many things, and you have to, boxers for years would be like, these guys don't know what they're doing. They'd lose in a boxing ring, which is like, yeah, the Go is a harder game than chess, but you get a Go master on a chessboard, and obviously he's going to lose to the chess master. Like, duh, it's a game. The guy who's the best guy at the sport or the game is going to win. And I have a whole nother Ari Emanuel conspiracy theory, because when they let Conor McGregor fight Floyd Mayweather in a boxing match, That annihilated all the work that Zuffa and the whole MMA revolution had done. Because in 2016, it was well known in pop culture that the toughest man on the world was the UFC heavyweight champion. No doubt about it. They had seen boxers fight in MMA and lose. They'd seen boxers actually get fluke knockouts too. And boxing was one of the key. I mean, nobody ever said boxing doesn't work. They just said boxing's limited. Boxers don't know how to deal with leg kicks. Boxers don't know how to deal with kicks. Boxers don't know how to deal with takedowns, et cetera, et cetera. Boxers definitely don't know how to deal with submissions. But nobody ever said boxing doesn't work. It wasn't, like the dim mock death touch or some of this traditional martial arts hoo-ha that doesn't work. Or even like Wing Chun, which is a respected kung fu style that excels in the trapping range, but I've never seen anybody really apply it. I've seen people apply Taekwondo successfully in MMA. I've seen people apply karate well in MMA, and that took some thinking and some adaptation. It was the work of people, Lyoto Machida and Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is a karate style fighter. He fights in a weird side stance, and Muay Thai fighters or boxers, people who fight square on, they're like, this is the more efficient way to fight. Karate's not efficient. My style's going to win. But karate's like, yeah, but I'm staying out of range and I'm jumping into range and I'm timing your shot and I'm going to get that kill shot. And, may the best style win. And that was what was exciting to me about MMA was like, I mean, the first thing was like, wow, this little guy's beating all these big guys through science. He's using technique that he's been taught. He's not a tough guy. He's not a big, strong guy. He was obviously tough because, Hoist Gracie won some wars against some big dudes who hurt him and came back and beat them, but then he turns into this coward fight ducker,
Real quick, it's crazy
but
because there is like there's a mechanics to it, to MMA. And I like,
oh, it's a science.
I get, yeah, it was funny because I've had Pat Miletich on the show, who I'm not
Oh my God.
politically,
Pat
we do
hates
not
me, but
agree on a lot, but it's funny because, Pat
great
really is
fighter.
brilliant when it comes to his field of MMA.
Yeah, I hated him. I was not a fan of him at the time, but he was a great coach, great trainer. I have mad respect for him as a martial artist.
Well, that's the thing, though. You can separate the politics of these fighters from the, brilliance of their understanding of MMA. And
yeah,
the note I wanted to close on was, I think it's a big mistake when liberals or even left-leaning people just look at MMA and say, "Oh, it's like I don't know if you remember the 2017 Golden Globes. Meryl Streep gave that acceptance speech where she said, if we kick foreigners out, you'll have nothing to watch but football and MMA, which are not the arts." And listen, I don't want to kick out foreigners either, but you don't have to get the dig in about MMA. It's just going to
or
alienate people.
football. I mean,
Or football. Yeah, it's the same.
but
Like it's these are incredible athletes, and there are people
human beings have always gathered in circles to watch athletes compete and to watch people fight sports. I mean, Muhammad Ali is one of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century. He would not have had a platform if it wasn't for boxing. And because boxing is such a test of character and skill, and MMA is harder than boxing. That's proven fact. Like, it takes more training. I mean, you have to learn so much more. And if you fight under MMA rules or in a street fight or a prison fight or whatever, the MMA guy will win 90, way more often.
I sometimes feel as if people were more mad that there was a UFC event on the White House lawn than the fact that it was our taxpayer money that went into that. It was over $100 million that went into Freedom
Yeah.
250. It's like, I'm mad about that. I'm not
Yeah.
mad at MMA existing. I like MMA, and I don't think it says anything about you if you like MMA. I don't think it means you're right wing or left wing. It just,
It just means you have an inherent, you're drawn to violence. You're drawn, we live in a violent world. We evolved from violent apes. I mean, watch what there's a chimp war going on
but
right
the real
now.
scandal should be that
The government, the theft. Yeah. And the way they treat the fighters and all this stuff. Falling for the culture war BS is how you lose to Trump. That's why Trump liked this. Whoever, regardless of whether Trump thought of it or Turkey al-Sheikh's people or whoever thought of this idea, on a certain level, it was brilliant politics because it was like, let's take something that's really popular, especially with young men, especially young white men, who were losing, just like they're losing rural voters and everybody else, because Trump's kind of the Keir Starmer of America. He didn't get a mandate because people loved him. He got a mandate because people were sick of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and George Bush and Dick Cheney. And the fact that Kamala Harris was out there campaigning with Liz Cheney tells you everything you need to know about the Uniparty. Trump was elected because people were so disgusted that they were like, I'll try anything. And there's, of course, the 30% that's always fascist and racist. And they're the only ones still with him. But he has betrayed every campaign promise. He was Mr. I'm not going to get any more wars. And now he's gotten us in the most disastrous war in American history, I think. And
It sucks too, by the way, for all of this sucks for, I know this is a small point, but it sucks for MMA fans too, because it's like, if you
yeah,
like MMA now, people look at you askance and they'll be like, what, are you some kind of right winger? You know?
yeah, it does suck. But my feelings about MMA are deeply complicated because just one last point before we wrap, because if you ever get a chance, there's two series of fights. These Robbie Lawler and Rory McDonald fought each other twice, and Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos fought each other three times for the heavyweight title. And the second McDonald Lawler fight and the second uh, Cain Velasquez Junior Dos Santos fight broke my heart because I was watching athletes that I had met, that I had seen, physical lions, human gods be destroyed before my eyes. Junior Dos Santos walked into that cage with Cain Velasquez for that second fight as one man, and he was destroyed over 5 rounds before our eyes, killed, I mean, diminished, years taken off his life. And there used to be a GIF that showed his face at the beginning of every round, and it was heartbreaking. And the same thing happened to Roy McDonald against Robbie Lawler, and they got their licks in. JDS knocked out Velasquez in the first fight. Didn't, Cain is probably the better fighter, but Rory definitely got his licks in on Robbie Lawler and shaved, both guys did serious damage to the other guy. This to me, it's kind of like porn where it's like, you know, I've enjoyed it. It's got its place. I think people should be free to do it, but this comes at a cost to the performers that the audience can voyeuristically participate in the human sacrifice that we're watching inside the cage and walk away laughing and walk away unharmed. And I think it should be treated as a sacred right, like the pagans did, just like porn. Like the literature, the Roman literature, pornography comes from Roman biographies of prostitutes. That was all systematically destroyed by the Christians. But obviously that was a big thing to Roman culture, that they respected these women. Like this was their thing. They're important people. We need to know their life stories. And if you've ever read the life stories of different porn performers, gay porn, whatever, these people are putting on the line. They are performers. People are paying money to watch them have sex, do something that everybody else can do. Anybody can fight. Nobody's going to pay money to watch me fight unless it's on World Star Hip Hop and I'm having a meltdown at Starbucks and getting put in my place. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say in closing, I mean the moment that like blew my mind and really got me into MMA was going back and watching the Pride Grand Prix 2000 finals. And everyone talks about, well, Sakuraba being the Gracie hunter, but he does 90 minutes and then he has the other match with Igor. I'm blanking on his name.
Vovchanchin.
Yeah,
Vovchanchin.
and he
Ukrainian fighter. Great
yeah,
fighter.
but like just to see Sakuraba keep going, even though he eventually breaks down in exhaustion,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
went like 90 minutes and then some. And it's like
Yeah.
just to see that human feat of just willpower, like that's what makes me love the sport.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see human beings being tested to a degree. You
They
see
go beyond the
bravery.
limits of human endurance
Yeah.
sometimes.
You see endurance, bravery, athleticism, strategy, skill, all combined in this crucible of a conflict with one other person. I mean, I've been around fighters. I've personally purposely distanced myself from fighters and fight managers over the course of my career and tried to keep my perspective as I'm just a fan who watches this on the screens. I try not to know the behind the scenes stuff. I try to just take it in that way. But if you've met these guys, these are there's an aura to a fighter. I mean, this is American culture, boxers, Jack Johnson. I mean, Miles Davis didn't name albums after many people, right? Like, sorry for this, but Jack Johnson had been dead and disgraced. Like, he was hated. Racist America turned on that guy and vilified him for decades, like they did Ulysses S. Grant. Miles Davis didn't name many other albums after anybody that I know of, right? Like, he meant something to Miles, and Miles means something to everybody with ears. And it's just like, goddamn, people, like, this is reality. This is human endeavor. Have some respect. These men and women are dying for you. They are shaving years off your life for the entertainment of the crowd. And goddamn it, people need to be entertained. Our lives suck. The opportunities are closing down. People, they're building data centers all around us, massive prison complexes. ICE is rampaging through our cities. Like, let people have, even the stupidest racist dumbass deserves a break, Like, I mean, country music fans deserve Charlie Pride. Like, this is, people need a break. People need a fantasy. People need to think, I might be handicapped. I might be a pussy. I might be weak. I'm a coward. I'm lazy. I'm not brave. I'm not coordinated. I can't see, but I can vicariously live through somebody, and when you could believe in the dream, like somebody like Georges St. Pierre, who's not just a great fighter, but it seems to be a pretty good role model. Then you got John Jones and the regular. I don't expect anything from people who are fighters. It's just like, I don't expect strippers to be moral paragons either, but what, they're making a living, and there's a need, they're meeting a need, right? Like, people sometimes will be like, well, he's got a conviction, he shouldn't be allowed to fight. I'm like, if you don't let people fight, I mean, look at Sonny Liston. Like, the guy was a criminal. Like, what else can they do? Like, let them contribute to society as they can.
I know we have to close, but it's like, even with someone like Strickland, I sometimes wonder if someone like Strickland would have been even worse off if he had not found MMA.
Yeah, I mean, what would he's obviously got this energy and a certain amount of charisma and talent, and I mean, that energy is going to go somewhere, and you know, I mean, you can either
It's an
express
outlet
it.
for some people.
Yeah,
It's almost like a
yeah,
therapy, I think. Yeah.
yeah. It's what they've chosen to do with their lives, and there's plenty of fighters I've known. I'm glad the dude's in the gym 8 hours a day. I'm glad he's exhausted at the end of the day, like, because he's not, like, look at poor Dustin Poirier, who just had a drunken incident in an airport the other day. I felt terrible for that, and he apologized and made an ass of himself drunkenly in public, and admitted, like, I didn't know, I'm retired. I don't know what to do with myself. I mean, look at Floyd Mayweather. The guy's been fleeced for a massive fortune, you know. Um,
Or even like you see it with Shamrock having to come back to fight after fight, and it's like sad now almost.
oh, it's very sad. And Ken Shamrock ends up getting sued into the ground by the UFC. I mean, the fighters have lost some. Mark Hunt sued the UFC and Brock Lesnar because they pretty much allegedly let Brock Lesnar get away with using PEDs, performance enhancing drugs, before Hunt fought Lesnar, and Hunt lost his lawsuit badly because the American court system is, like, based on who's got more money. I mean, it's not based on finding justice. It's just a weighing contest. Who's got more money? And sometimes your legal argument can add to the weight, but if you don't have the money, you're not going to go anywhere. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm sorry I've
Hey,
rambled so
plug
much.
plug the plug the website real quick. I'm so sorry.
The,
We went 2 hours, folks. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. The MMA Draw, where Zach Arnold and I write on Substack about the business practices of MMA, and there's lots of other great MMA journalists that are covering aspects of the sport, but we're the ones that are focused on Ari Emanuel and TKO in a way that nobody else is, and right now I don't even really cover fights. I cover Ari Emanuel because this guy is a powerhouse in American culture and American business and geopolitics, and people need to know who he is and what he's up to. And we're doing our best to try to let people know Dana White is not the issue here. Dana White's just a sock puppet, and there are big money players much smarter than Dana White and Donald Trump, who will be on the scene after Dana White and Donald Trump are both gone. And the Emanuels will be a factor, and their friends and their business partners and their international allies, long after we're all dead and forgotten. And people need to be aware of who's zooming who and who's pulling the strings behind this stuff, because it's scam upon scam upon scam. It's human sacrifice, literally in the octagon and the boxing ring. And they're stealing. They are underpaying, systematically, laughably underpaying their fighters. And it's just, that's an affront. That's an affront to everything. I mean, if you believe in sport, if you believe in martial arts, if you believe in honor and dignity and fairness and workers' rights, you should have some respect for these fighters, and don't be angry at the fighters or the fans. Don't engage in this blue versus red shell game. Look behind the scenes. Look at the puppet masters and the big money and power. And that's our little niche of the world. And we're trying to, flicker our Bics and shine some light on some people who would really rather not, who go to great lengths to not be linked to their own to the thing that made them billionaires. And we could come back and do a whole show on how they screwed Vince McMahon out of the WWE, and how Janelle Grant and her suit, and God bless her, victim.
You cover the wrestling stuff too?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're owned by TKO. We don't get as much into it, but yeah, we try to cover Zach's a real.
I'd love to do an entire episode on that. I won't go 2 hours next time, though. I promise.
Yeah. I haven't been a hardcore wrestling fan since the 80s. I even slept on the Attitude Era and all that stuff. Watched a few of those, legendary events in the 90s with some friends that were into wrestling. But, I'm definitely not a WWE head by any respect, but I do follow their business. And I know who's running that business. And I watch Mark Shapiro and Ari Emanuel and Nick Khan. Nick Khan is a guy we haven't even talked about. But he and Ari Emanuel, there are lawsuits alleging that they worked with Vince McMahon, who was under threat of criminal sanction and civil lawsuit by Janelle Grant, to basically steal the McMahon family fortune out from under them, and promised Vince McMahon he would be the man, and he was gone within months. And
okay, I'm gonna ask you.
We got to come back. Yeah,
you got to come back maybe next month or something, because I know that I have a lot of listeners that are interested in that case.
Yeah, it's dirty, dirty stuff. And Nick Khan and Ari Emanuel and Mark Shapiro are genius Hollywood wheeler dealers and business people. And there's lawsuits that allege they did people dirty in that. And Vince was definitely vulnerable because of his own conduct, allegedly. I believe it, but I can't prove it. She's, I don't know what this current standing of that case is, but God, the details that came out. Yeah. So anyway, thanks so much.
Thanks again, Nate Wilcox.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
the way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.